today in this video, we're going to look at this idea of composition again, but we're going to reconsider how you make your compositions, what your process is, what you're thinking about, and add some additional strategies that you can use to create even stronger and better compositions for yourself. So first, we just want to address what we mean by that. And of course, a composition is really the word we use for what it is you want to put into this work of art, whether you're making a landscape or you're drawing people, or maybe it's a still life with objects, or maybe you're just doing something abstract. But you're going to make decisions of, this is what it is I'm putting onto that piece of paper. Then you have to decide how. Where are you going to put all these things you want to put into this work of art on that piece of paper? And that's where I want you to consider for a moment, how do you usually do that? Let's say you're going to draw a piece of fruit. You're like, okay, I'm going to draw an apple. Do you just kind of whip out your piece of paper and just go for it? Do you have a picture in mind of how you want it to look and end up? Do you really stop and consider, I want to put it here on my paper because I want some empty space for the shadow on the right side of my composition, so I'm going to leave some room for that, and I want some air above the apple. So I'm going to make sure and place my apple and kind of scale it here on, let's say, the lower left-hand corner of my page, because that's the design and the thinking I need to go through to get to the piece that I want. I want to make sure that you are considering that before you even put pen on paper or pencil on paper, right? So we are going to go through a list of strategies and examples that you are going to utilize in our project. The first one is, strategy 1 is this idea of overlapping, something we've looked at before in Art 1 with the still life. Just this idea that if you, instead of just stacking objects along a line, you actually overlap them and block one object behind the other. It gives us more visual interest because our mind kind of imagines what that object looks like and we complete it. We do this without even thinking about it, honestly. It also gives us that sense of depth that we might be going for as well on that piece of paper. So that's our first strategy. The second strategy is having a strong diagonal. Instead of just having things lined up, again, along a flat horizontal, which horizontal lines, we can put a lot of adjectives on a horizontal line looking at this saying, well, it's calm, it's straightforward. We can also say it's slightly static. It's not as dynamic or interesting. So a strong diagonal can help add interest and just take a work from being good to great. And that's exactly what's happening in these two paintings. These two artists, in their own way, have played with this idea of a diagonal. She has established that diagonal through the positioning of the chair and the little girl kind of lounging back in the chair. She could have had the chair fully frontal facing us or sideways, but this strong diagonal really does help lead our eye through the composition and does make it more interesting. Our next strategy is the idea of the rule of 3, or odds versus evens. So you might look at these and go, okay, it's pairs, Miss Lovell. Yay! A painting of pears. Yes, that's true. And you might never want to put this in your house or think it's particularly interesting. But if we're going to eliminate kind of those thoughts and just look at this idea of having a complete set of 2 or 3, what is happening when you make those choices? In our world, things are set up binary. So we have up, down, right, left, hot, cold. We like pairs. People, form, you have your best friend, you have a friendship pairing, you have relationships where you have 2, right? So that feels like a complete set. It's satisfying, but it's kind of like you're standing on the outside of that pair. When you pair of pairs. Sorry, bad joke. But when we throw in that third pair, it becomes a bit more interesting and dynamic because, and even here, the way he's positioned them, he's almost doing that for us, where we have this set of pairs, these 2 pairs sitting here together, and then this one's kind of like, hey, let me in. I want to get in on this conversation. But it makes it open-ended and almost like we could join into this conversation too because we have the outlier here. So using 3 things, a repetitive object, or maybe it's even a color is repeated in one specific way 3 times through a composition, can make for just, again, a more interesting dynamic composition. So something to keep in mind. Strategy 4 is the rule of thirds. Now this has nothing to do with this idea of I would have 3 of the same thing in my composition. This has to do with actually breaking up your paper surface into a grid where you're dividing it into thirds both vertically and horizontally. And where you have a line dividing it into a third, you either can place your main point of emphasis in that composition or your main object. That makes for a pleasing composition. Or you place your main object, and in this case it's the houseboat, you place that hitting the points of intersection where the grid lines intersect. So that always lends itself to a very successful composition. So here, if we look at this painting without grid lines, but we imagine grid lines, if I'm going to chop it in thirds like this, then she is sitting right in the center of that grid with the umbrella sitting kind of crossing straight through one of the third grid lines. So again, that helps this piece in terms of a successful overall composition. Then strategy 5 is something called the golden ratio. This is something that goes way back to the Renaissance. Artists were actually very much aware of this, and they would design their pieces with this in mind on purpose. And it wasn't just visual artists, actually musicians did this too. So you can look it up. It's based on the idea of the spiral and how it opens up and where the greatest point in height in this curve comes to and then starts to recede and curl back around again. That mark right there, that is the golden mean, which is this line division. It's not quite a 2/3 to 1/3 division, but it's close to it. So that's how I like to think of it. But if we look at this following painting, you're going to see I've put this red line across here, which can be a little, I'll move it so it's not so distracting for a second. So this apple tree is smack sitting on that golden mean line. And, you know, this is a basic painting in terms of what it is. You know, it's like, oh, look, it's a meadow with an apple tree. There it is. There's a little person over there. But using that compositional device of the golden ratio has made it more successful. Then we come to our last strategy, which is closed versus open composition. So what we mean by this is the objects that you've chosen, are they going to be fully complete and we see them resolve themselves and they're not chopped off by the border of the paper, or do we lose them off the page? It's simply that decision. This idea has become quite popular lately. We like to have things spilling off the edges of our paper versus everything is contained and complete within the border of the paper. I think this has a satisfying like completedness for us. Like it's like, oh, that just feels so neat and tidy and satisfying. This is interesting because our mind almost wonders, well, what's going on off over here? Like, is there more of a pile of stuff? I wonder. So this leads itself to kind of more questions. This kind of gives us that satisfying, complete look of, I know what I'm looking at and it's satisfying and done. Neither one of these is wrong, one better than the other. It's simply a choice you can make. So you're going to use at least one of these strategies in your compositional design and kind of account for you thinking about how you might use one of these strategies and showing that in your design for the piece you're going to make.